Whoa, what is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. Giants have been making a lot of moves during this free agency period, and I've been busy with work. So I just said to myself, I'll wait until they make the majority of their moves, and then I'll just make one big video recapping all the things that the New York Giants did during this free agency period. Talk about some of the players that we lost as well. Break down some of the contracts. Now, the specifics on the contracts have not come out yet. Once they do, I'll make a separate video on that, talking about the impact that it will have on the 2024 cap and beyond. But the one thing I'll say coming out of this free agency period for Joe Schoen, that's the one huge positive I take out of it above almost anything else, is the fact that Joe Schoen was able to fill holes for this football team during the free agency period, whether it be via trade or whether it be player acquisition. But he did not really hurt the long-term stability of this football team from a salary cap standpoint, because the majority of these contracts are contracts that we could get out of after a year, if not two. But he was able to fill holes and best set this team up for the draft, which at the end of the day is what free agency is meant for. It's not meant to find your core pieces on your football team. Sure, are there over-the-top pieces you could find in free agency as the team further develops, like the Giants did with a guy like Nacho Roche? Absolutely. But the core of your team and the way that Joe Schoen wants to build this team is through the draft. And what I took out of this free agency period more than anything else is now Joe Schoen has complete freedom to do whatever he wants at the top of this year's draft, whether it be the first round, second round, third round. We all knew going into this free agency period that we needed to add weapons. And we all knew that there weren't any premium weapons really available unless it was via trade. The wide receiver market was kind of plugged with a bunch of second-tier wide receivers. Jacoby Myers, I guess, being the most attractive name. He only got $11 million on the open market. Juju Smith-Schuster, never a guy that I really thought the Giants would take seriously. He's a guy that we could bring in here. So the Giants decided to go the second-tier route outside of Darren Waller. And we'll talk about this in this video. And I think a main reason why Joe Schoen did that, because he doesn't view the majority of these guys as long-term answers at the wide receiver position. He views them as stopgap options that help improve the overall wide receiver core, but they're guys that are probably going to be eventually replaced, whether it be in this year's draft with a wide receiver they may select, whether it be in next year's draft with a wide receiver that they may select. Make no mistake about it, Shane is going to stay committed to his mission, which is building this team up from the ground up. But this is not a complete rebuild. As you have noticed, the New York Giants have brought back several of their former players. And when you really think about it, it's crazy. I think I saw a stat. I posted on Twitter. I retweeted it from somebody. I think there were 3 Giants from like 2011 on that were re-signed by the team after being drafted. I could be wrong on that. You could double check. But I think it was Jason Pierre-Paul. I think it was Sterling Shepard. And I think it was Odell Beckham. And Odell Beckham was traded before he even got to start that second contract with the New York Giants. Well, look at this. Daniel Jones is back. Darius Slayton is back on a second contract. Saquon Barkley's been tagged. He's probably going to receive a second contract. We all know Dex is going to get a second contract. We all know Andrew Thomas is going to get a second contract. It's entirely possible guys like Ojulari and McKinney could get second contracts. So what is Joe Schoen doing? He's taking some of the core foundational pieces of this team. He's building with them. He's keeping them in-house, and he's going to continue to build up through the draft. That is how you build a culture, and that is what he has expressed since he's been here. He hasn't pulled any punches. He hasn't lied to us. And this free agency period only drove that point home further. He used this period, to fill in holes for the roster. But his big damage that's going to get done this offseason is in the draft. But what he was able to do in this draft, like I said, now doesn't force him to have to take a wide receiver in the first round. He could take a corner. He could take a center. He could do whatever he wants with those picks, which is exactly what you should want as a fan of this football team. You want Joe Schoen to be able to take the best player available, because we have a lot of holes on this team, and I love what he was able to accomplish in free agency based on the overall market. But let's talk about some of the players that he brought in. We'll talk about Darren Waller as the video gets going. We're going to start the free agency route, and then we'll talk about the trade for Darren Waller, who obviously is probably going to be the premier weapon in this offense this year, and I can't wait to see what he does with the New York Giants. But in terms of the free agency movement, both players that we lost and both players that we brought in, you start at the top, and it's the biggest name, right? Bobby Okereke. Yes, I found out how to pronounce the name finally. Me and several others did not know how to really pronounce Bobby's name when the New York Giants went out there and signed him to a contract of 4 years, $40 million. And a lot of people, when they saw that contract, went bananas. They went ballistic because they saw some of the contracts that some of the other linebackers were signing for in free agency. But listen, this guy's 26. He's a guy that, when clearly identified, would fit this scheme very well. And when you really think about it, 3 years after the fact, he's getting paid less on a per year average than Blake Martinez did in a much higher market at a very similar, at the same position, at the same age. And I honestly think Bobby Okereke has a higher ceiling than Blake Martinez ever did. He's a tackle machine, much like Blake. He had almost 300 tackles over the last 2 years. But when you watch him on film, when you watch him on tape, when you watch his highlights, he's just much more athletic. He could drop back in coverage. It's not necessarily his strongest attribute, but he's certainly capable. Good side-to-side quickness. Good in terms of diagnosing the run. And he is a clear upgrade for this New York Giants football team at that linebacker position. I don't even think it's a debate. It was probably the weakest position group the New York Giants have had. You think about some of the linebackers that this team has gone through the last 3 or 4 years. We're talking about Tate Crowder, Mr. Irrelevant. We're talking about Devontae Downs. Like, we're not talking about the creme de la creme. So they went out there and they brought in a legitimate man in the middle. And as a Giants fan, I absolutely love it because it gives us the freedom that we need to, much like the wide receiver position as they addressed it in free agency, to be able to build up in other areas on this roster in the draft and not feel forced to have to take a linebacker early. Of course, if they love Simpson, take him if that's your best player on the board. But it gives Joe Schoen a lot more options because that was clearly, arguably, our biggest need. We didn't have a starting middle linebacker on this roster going into next year. Yes, you could point to Beavers. Beavers hasn't played a snap in the NFL. He's coming off an injury. Micah McFadden did not display enough, at least for me to feel confident that he's an every down linebacker going into next year. So the Giants had major question marks at that position. And for them to be able to address that and only commit $22.5 million guaranteed, what more could you really ask for? I think he's going to be a fan favorite, and I think he's got Antonio Pierce written all over him. Pierce, as we recall, wore number 58, came from within the division, and was our best middle linebacker probably since Carl Banks. So I absolutely love this move. I think he's going to make an immediate impact for this football team, and he is going to make this defense way better than it was last year. Just his presence in the middle is going to help tremendously as the Giants continue to try to, improve that run defense. And you saw that's what they did with their first 2 moves. Another thing I'll say about Okereke and the guy that I'm going to talk about next, Joe Schoen talks about dependability, talks about guys that could stay on the field. Well, Okereke has only missed 2 games throughout his entire career. So I think that's something they also valued when making this signing, and probably they felt was a guy that is ascending. You'll notice, again, a pattern with these free agent acquisitions by Joe Schoen. The majority of them, their age, right around as young as you can be when you first hit free agency after a rookie salary. Whether it be Okereke, whether it be Daniel Jones, who is only 25 years old. And I think Schoen, whether it be Paris Campbell, Darius Slayton, and I think Joe Schoen, when he signed these players, was looking at their potential growth. He's not judging them just strictly based off of how they've produced so far in the NFL. He's judging them in terms of evaluating them from a contract standpoint as to what they can do in his scheme as they continue to ascend as young players. So I love that move. And to me, that's probably my favorite move that the New York Giants made, because we were that desperate to get a middle linebacker. The second guy we'll talk about on this list is Nick Gates. We'll talk about some of the departures. I kind of knew this was going to happen all year, to be honest with you. Patricia Traynor kind of gave me hints all year, if I'm being honest, but it makes sense. They have to choose between him and John Feliciano. We still have not signed John Feliciano quite yet. So as of now, the Giants don't even have a guy that they could really feel comfortable starting in the middle. Not that I feel really comfortable starting John Feliciano, but at least he started for the Giants at that position last year. But I always kind of felt like as the season wore along that we were probably going to part ways with Nick Gates. Wish him nothing but the best. Giants obviously have to make that a priority in the draft, right? They have not really addressed the offensive line at all thus far in free agency, and it really leads me to believe that that will be a primary area in which they try to hone in on, especially if they lose Feliciano, because then you would have lost Gates and Feliciano. You have not really signed anybody in free agency to fill that void. So I think the Giants definitely will attack the offensive line relatively early in this draft. I could see it as early as the first round. I'm probably leaning more towards the second, and then possibly a day 3 pick on the interior offensive line as well. We all know we need a lot of help at that spot, and Nick Gates going to Washington only weakens it that much more. We also lost Julian Love, and for what Love signed for, I talked about countless times in my videos, I would have been comfortable in the $5 to $7 million range. I wouldn't have wanted to exceed that if I was Joe Schoen. He signed for $6 million a year, 2 years, $12 million. In terms of the guaranteed salary, it actually doesn't list it here. So I'll be interested to see what, when that comes out, exactly what it was. I'm a little bit surprised that the Giants didn't offer him a contract. But in the end, Joe Schoen talked about it in several of the press conferences leading up into free agency. He said that the safety class was very strong. He said that he liked a lot of safeties in this year's draft. He also drafted Dane Belton last year, along with Pinnock, who they brought in via free agency last year. So they probably value those guys relatively highly and think that they may be able to step in. And they probably also plan to draft the safety at some point in this draft, possibly as high as day 2. I don't think they would take one in day 1. But Julian Love's departure certainly hurts. He's a captain. He's a leader in the locker room. I don't think he's a great player. I think he's a good player. I think he's a great guy and a good player. Certainly replaceable, especially at the safety position. There's always safeties you could find in the 3, 4, 5 round area, but the Giants will have to hit on that pick this year during the draft. But I certainly will start looking at some safeties. And that's the beauty of free agency as a fan, as a content creator. Now it really gives me an eye, and I'm going to start doing my draft content actually tonight. Won't be uploaded on the channel tonight, but I'm going to talk about day 1 prospects. Probably going to be an hour-long podcast. Can't wait to do it. And I'm sure I'm going to start to sprinkle in some safeties in terms of day 2 prospects, because now that is an obvious need, if nothing else, for depth purposes in this year's draft with the departure of Julian Love. Next up, we're going to talk about Darius Slayton. To me, this was the biggest surprise. Not that I was surprised as free agency got going. I wasn't surprised like a day or 2 before he signed. I was actually starting to lean that was becoming more and more of a possibility. But going into free agency, I did not think the Giants were going to bring back Darius Slayton for the simple reason I thought his market was going to be higher. I thought the whole wide receiver market was going to be higher than it was. No doubt about it. It was a very, very, very soft free agency class. Not going to tell you otherwise, but you can only, who's ever in the best in the market, usually teams are willing to overspend. Credit to all the teams around the league this year. They stood hard to, they put their feet in the sand, as Joe Schoen likes to call it, and no wide receiver got more than $11 million per year. I was of the belief that Jacoby Myers was going to get 15 or 16, which would only drive up the price for players like Darius Slayton, meaning I thought he'd be in that $8, $9 million range. In the end, the Giants were able to bring back Darius Slayton for 2 years, $12 million. He has the possibility with incentives to hit 16. And once I see the full details of these contracts, I'll break down all of them in terms of the incentives and everything else. Can't wait to dive into that with all of you guys throughout these videos. But that's another thing that you noticed with Joe Schoen and these contracts. A lot of them were incentive-based. And what does it do? It gives you a little bit more cap flexibility. And if the player hits those incentives, well, he's certainly worth the price that you have to pay him due to that, right? We talked about the Daniel Jones incentives. I'm sure that the Darius Slayton incentives will be similar. Do I like that Slayton's back? 100%. I think it was a fair market rate. $6 million a year for a guy last year who was a good wide receiver. He's definitely not a 1. I still don't think he's a 2, but I think he's a good 3. And getting him back here, having that speed on the outside, that would have been a missing element to this offense had Darius Slayton not been back. That's not to say that you couldn't have drafted a speedster in the draft. And yes, we know that we brought in Campbell, who we'll talk about in a bit, who I'm really excited about. But regardless, to have that speed on the outside, yeah, he definitely brings some value, especially having the threat now of a guy like Darren Waller, who could go over the middle, create mismatches there, creates more attention for the defense. Well, now you have guys like Campbell and like Darius Slayton who could take the top off a defense. The Giants also now have a lot of height in that wide receiver room, right? Isaiah Hodgins, 6'4", Darren Waller, 6'6", Bellinger, 6'5", and yes, I'm including the tight ends. Campbell, 6'1", Darius Slayton, 6'1". And you got some burners with Slayton and Campbell, not to mention Wan'Dale Robinson. So the Giants definitely could pose a lot of different looks. And if you're Kafka, how does that not excite you? So I like that Slayton was back. Giants elected to go with 2 mid-tier wide receivers. We'll get to the other one right after. Nacho Roche. So at least that's what he wants to be called. Nacho, I believe. I think it's pronounced Raheem Nunez Roches. Defensive tackle, 20. He's almost 30 years old. From Tampa Bay. It was 3 years, $12 million. I think 7 or so was guaranteed. There was a 1 year out, though, after the first year for $5.5 million. I got to sneeze. Hold on 1 second. I was going to have to. I muted the mic. I don't edit these videos. If I have to sneeze it a bit, I will mute the mic. But as far as Roches goes, we all know that the Giants have a ton of needs on the interior defensive line. All you got to do is go back and look at the Eagles game last year, the Cowboys game last year. We got mauled up at the point of attack. They're bringing in Roche for one thing and one thing only, to stuff the run. The same reason why we had Danny Shelton here didn't work out too well. But I think he's a depth guy. I don't think he's a guy that's going to see maybe more than 35 to 40% of the snaps. He's going to be out there specifically against the run. And what you noticed was Shane's first two acquisitions were him and Okereke. Why? Because the Giants last year against the run might have been the worst defense in the entire National Football League. With those two additions, that alone will help significantly improve this year's run defense. So I like the pickup. It was for very little. You're talking $4 million a year, only $7.5 million guaranteed, with an out for $5.5 million after year one. Have you seen what defensive tackles have been getting paid during this free agency period? So even for a backup defensive tackle, that contract's not very bad, and it's a short-term commitment, much like the majority of these contracts. I mean, look, when you look at all these contracts, before we get into the rest of the players, we know about Jones's contract. It's a 4-year deal. That's more than likely going to be a 3-year commitment. Bobby Okereke is probably going to be a 2-year commitment. It's a 4-year deal. It's only $22.5 million guaranteed. Then you got Darius Slayton that has a 1-year out for $6 million. So they get out after next year if they wanted to. Same thing kind of with Nacho, who I just talked about. Paris Campbell is literally a 1-year deal, as is Matt Breida, as is Jeff Schmidt. And we'll talk about the big one at the end of this video. But that was a common theme to these acquisitions for Joe Schoen. What he used these players for is to be stopgaps, or at least the majority of them. Maybe some stopgaps with upside. A guy like Paris Campbell, if he plays very well, you bring him back on a longer contract, but you at least get to get a taste. It's kind of like when you go on a cruise. You get a little bit of a sample of every spot that you go to. And if you like one of the spots, you go back on a longer vacation. I think it's the same approach he's taking with a guy like Paris Campbell, for example, who we're going to bring up right now. A guy that I absolutely loved coming out of Ohio State. Go back, watch my mock draft videos that year. I mentioned him several times as a guy that I liked as an early second-round candidate. Love him. I loved him coming out. Why? Because he's got height and he's got speed, and he was incredibly productive at the collegiate level. Now, Campbell's been banged up since he's been in the NFL. Last year was the first year where he got a full allotment of snaps. He played all 17 games. He had over 600 yards receiving, but he brings a different dynamic to this receiving core. He's only 25 years old. He'll be 26 at the start of the season, and it's a 1-year deal. It's a 1-year deal for $4.7 million. I think it's 3, but then it's like easy incentives that he could hit. And I think it's a really smart deal for Campbell as well, because if you're Paris Campbell and his agent, you look at the Giants with Brian Daboll, with Mike Kafka, as an offense that's emerging, that's getting better. And he probably feels it's an offense he fits well into, and he may be able to shine, being that he's not, if not the number 1 wide receiver right now, he's at least the number 2, probably in this wide receiving core. And with the creativity of both Kafka and Daboll, he should have a good year, and then maybe hits the open market next year and he gets paid very well. So I thought it made sense for both the Giants and Campbell. The Giants don't want to commit too much to him from a year standpoint because of his injury history. But if he can stay healthy, he is a significant upgrade, at least in my eyes, over Richie James. Yes, I know Richie James had good stats last year, but in terms of a prospect, I don't even think it's very close. He's much faster than Richie James ever was. James ran a 4.48 coming into the pros. Paris Campbell ran a 4.31. He's 6'1". You could play him in the slot, which is what he was intended to play when he came into the league. He's also fully capable of playing on the outside. And if you've listened to Joe Schoen this offseason, specifically talk about the wide receiver position, that's what he's talked about. He wants guys that could do multiple things, who you can move on the inside, you can move on the outside. That's exactly what Paris Campbell brings to the table. And I think he's a clear replacement for Richie James last year, just with much bigger playability. So I really like that move for the Giants. One of my favorite moves that they made. Then the Giants elect to bring back Matt Breida on a 1-year deal for $1.4 million. I think it could hit 2.5 with incentives, but about the same deal he came back last year. I think it was 1.1. Market goes up, you get a little bit of a raise. Love Breida. Breida to me is a guy that he's a multifaceted running back. He can catch the ball out of the backfield, and he actually ran a lot harder last year with the limited touches that he got than I thought he would. I viewed him kind of as a scat back, but Matt Breida ran really hard between the tackles. I think he's a good backup running back, a guy that could spell Saquon. I still want the Giants to draft a running back at some point in this year's draft, because this draft class is loaded with talent at that position. And I think they could kind of, hopefully, prolong Saquon Barkley's career if they can kind of get a thumper in the middle, a guy that could give you 10 to 12 carries a game so Saquon doesn't have to take those big hits. Maybe use Barkley more out in space as a pass catcher more so than we've done in the past. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with that overall running back core this offseason. But I'm glad that Breida's back. He's a leader. Obviously, a guy that Dable and Schoen are very familiar with from his days with Buffalo. And I thought he played well last year for the Giants when given the opportunity. Jeff Smith, to me, and a lot of people freaked out when this happened. Jeff Smith's a one-year deal. Jeff Smith's a one-year deal. It's about about the same as Breida. $1.5 million. And he was brought here from the Jets for special teams purposes. And a lot of people scoff at that. Well, we need that. You think back to the days of Cody Core from a few years ago. He was great in terms of a gunner. I loved him in terms of a gunner fielding punts. And I think he's going to make this team for that reason and that reason alone. And there's a good chance a guy like Sterling Shepard could be on the outside looking in if he's competing with a guy like Smith for the simple reason he brings that value to the special teams unit. He's supposed to be very good in that area. And that's clearly why the Giants brought him in for a very low rate. So I like that move. We needed a lot of help on our special teams. We were horrible in punt coverage. This should help that. So good move there and bring some depth. And again, young, 25 years old. And then finally, we're going to talk about Jihad Ward. Just want to mention him briefly as well. Happy he's back. Seemed to be a leader in the locker room. I don't think the contract specifics have come out yet. We just know that it's a one-year deal. Expect it to not be that high of a number, similar to the Breida contract. But again, a guy that was a leader in the locker room, a guy that seemed to be very respected, a guy that is very familiar with Wink Martindale, and brings more added depth in terms of the defensive line and the pass rush. So I like that move as well. Now we're going to talk about the big move. The Giants went out there and got Daniel Jones. I don't even think it's a debate. His best weapon since he's been a pro. And we're going to talk about the contract reconstruction. Today, the New York Giants backloaded some of the salary in order to free up more space this year. By doing so, they freed up about $8 million for this year's salary cap. And that kind of, if you do the math, is going to pretty much pay for this year's draft class. They could still elect to do other things if they want to make a trade, if they want to sign somebody, like sign Saquon, sign Dexter Lawrence, re-up Leonard Williams to alleviate a lot of cap pressure this year. So there's a lot of things they could do if they want to create some more cap space to do something else. Do I think they will? No. I think this was their big trade. Their big trade was Darren Waller. And basically the way the trade worked out was the Giants traded the 100th overall. Traded Tony for the 100th overall pick and like a 5th or 6th round pick, whatever it was. The Giants then took that pick they received in the trade, the 100th pick, kept the extra pick, the day 3 pick, and turned it into Darren Waller. And a lot of people are going to say, well, Darren Waller's injury prone. But what's Kadarius Toney? Kadarius Toney couldn't stay on the field as a New York Giant. And I understand that Darren Waller's a little bit older, but Darren Waller is a proven commodity when he can stay on the football field. And he has had injuries. He has. He's had 2 hamstring injuries this past year. And he's now 2 years removed. It'll be 3 at the start of the year removed from his last 1,000-yard season due to injuries and not really much else. And obviously increased targets from guys like Devontae Adams last year on the Raiders. But he has proven in the past that he is fully capable of being the featured receiver in an offense. He had 2 straight years in which he eclipsed 1,000 yards with the Raiders. And he's going to help this red zone offense tremendously. And I cannot wait to see how Mike Kafka uses Darren Waller in this offense. You look at the Chiefs games, you see the way that they use Travis Kelce in terms of pre-snap motion in the backfield, forward tosses. I expect creativity with a guy like Waller, and his speed and his dynamic should really help create mismatches and open up this offense this year in 2023. An offense that was already great in the red zone last year. We were ranked, I think, top 5, if not top 5, certainly very close to it last year in that department, largely due to Mike Kafka coming over and calling the plays. Well, now you had a 6'6" mismatch at the tight end spot. And now, if the defense has to pay a little bit more attention to him, you think about the mismatches that Saquon Barkley could create in the passing game as well at the running back position with an improved wide receiving core. Is the wide receiving core a finished product? Absolutely not. I think it's a moderate improvement getting Paris Campbell as opposed to Richie James. And you figure Wan'Dale Robinson, if he's healthy, should be a better wide receiver this year. And I expect them to spend one of their first 3 picks in the draft at the wide receiver position. And I just like the different elements now to this weaponry. I talked about the height earlier in the video. You got a 6'4" Hodges. You got a 6'5" Bellinger. You got a 6'6" Waller. You got Slayton at 6'1". You got Campbell at 6'1". You got speed all over when you include Wan'Dale Robinson to that list as well. You got Barkley who could catch the ball coming out of the backfield. And obviously, you got Jones's legs you have to worry about. I think this Giants offense, Daniel Jones year 2 in the scheme, with the weapons that we've now added to his arsenal, will be a much better offense in 2023. And it was an offense that jumped from near the league worst going into last year to league average. We finished, I think, 15th in points and 17th in yards, or maybe reverse it, but right around league average in both categories. I wouldn't be surprised if this offense is approaching top 10 with the coaches that we do have in place. So I'm really excited with the additions that this New York Giants team made, but they were smart. That's the thing I love about it. They're hole fillers, which is exactly, if you're a fan, that you should want out of free agency. You shouldn't be looking for Nate Soldiers in free agency. Guys that are supposed to be for your, saviors at the left tackle position. You shouldn't be looking for Kenny Galladay's. You should be looking for guys that are going to fill holes as you build up the team for, through the draft, especially at the point in time that the New York Giants are currently in. And for people that are complaining about that the New York Giants didn't get a number one wide receiver, who did you want? Who did you want in the world of reality? Were you going to hitch your wagon to Odell Beckham, who's going to be 31, coming off of 2 ACL tears? You're going to give him all the money that supposedly he's asking for. We'll see what he ultimately signs for. Were you going to hitch your wagon to Juju Smith-Schuster? Were you going to hitch your wagon to giving up draft capital for DeAndre Hopkins, who's 31, tons of injuries in his own right, makes a lot more money than Darren Waller on a per-year basis? I don't know. In terms of Darren Waller's contract, this is how it now breaks down. When we initially traded for him, he was actually going, I think, $13 million against the cap this year. Now it's $5 million. So it's like an $8 million in savings for this year's cap. But they obviously backloaded the corresponding years. They were each about 13. Now it's 14.5 next year, 15.5 the year after that, and 17.5 the year after that. But you also want to look at that dead cap hit. The dead cap hit next year all but assures Waller's probably going to see at least 2 years as a Giant, which I would hope he would. You gave a third-round pick to get him. You would hope it wouldn't only be a one-year experiment. He's 14.5 against the cap next year with a $7.5 million dead cap hit. The following year, if Waller continues to sustain injuries and he doesn't live up to the talent that, we're hoping he could be, it's an easy out. It's 15.5 against the cap. It's $5 million, to cut him. So you're saving over $10 million if you cut him after 2 years. So it'll be up to Waller to improve. But by the time that comes around, it's going to be a $280 million salary cap. So even that $15 million contract for a tight end, it doesn't look like that much. You're talking about 6% of the salary cap or thereabouts. So I love that move for Waller. I think it's going to change the whole dynamic of this offense, and I cannot wait for the start of the year. I mean, what more could you want out of free agency in the world of reality? The Giants went out there. They got a young, emerging linebacker. They got a little bit of depth on the D-line. Would I like a little more? Sure, but we could get it in the draft. They got two, I think, one great weapon and one pretty good weapon in Paris Campbell. They brought back Slayton. They brought back Shepard. We'll see if he makes the team. They brought in a special team specialist. They bring back Breida. And the Giants kept a lot of guys in-house. Barkley, Jones, that has to be factored in as well. They were able to keep those guys in. But Shane was able to do all of this without really negatively impacting the long-term future of this New York Giants football team. Because none of these contracts exceed 4 years, and none of them really exceed more than a 2-year commitment. Jones is at least approaching a 3-year commitment with his contract, but you would expect that at the quarterback position. Can't wait for the draft. If you ask me today, Chris, what's our biggest need coming out of free agency? Well, I'll show it in my mock draft. But right now, I think it's a corner, and I think it's a center with a wide receiver not that far behind. As always, guys, if you like what you watch, please subscribe. Drop a comment. Maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.